Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the historiography podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Bruce Chilton. And today's discussion is based on his new book, Queen in Roman Judea. So it's Berenice, Queen in Roman Judea. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Bruce, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So to start us off with, who exactly was Berenice?
Well, the reason that she came to prominence is that she belonged to one of the greatest dynasties within Roman Judea, namely the dynasty of Herod the Great. And Berenice was his great-granddaughter. As a result of that, she wound up being a part of the dynasty's attempt to regain power after the death of Herod the Great, and then ultimately, in her own right, became a player within the politics of Rome itself.
How did she come to power, and how did she come to into relations with Titus?
Well, the relationship with Titus actually began during the course of the Roman campaign that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and also the burning of the temple, which occurred formally under Titus. The reason Titus himself was in that pivotal position was that his father, Vespasian, who had begun the campaign in Judea, assigned to that task by the Emperor Nero, had taken Titus, his son, with him. And Vespasian himself came to be acclaimed as Roman emperor during the course of the Judean campaign. It was a remarkable ascent to power. And it was an ascent to power in which Berenice herself was quite an important influence. Roman historians comment on how Vespasian, the father, had appreciated the friendship with Berenice. She provided the family, both Vespasian and Titus, her son, with connections that she had in Alexandria, which meant that they, as necessary, could raise loans and also have access to Egyptian grain, which was crucial to maintaining power in Rome. So for all these reasons, Titus had a natural political affinity with Berenice. And in addition to that, when he and his father had invaded Galilee and set about the conquest of that area, they had stayed in Caesarea Philippi, which was her base city. And there, Titus and Berenice began an extremely well-known affair. And that affair lasted through the conquest of Jerusalem. And thereafter, they were separated for a few years. But by the year 75, she was in Rome, living with Titus. Observers at the time were scandalized because they said she was behaving openly as if she were already married to him. It was clear that marriage was promised, and she actually also took part in judging legal cases in Rome, as mentioned by the grammarian Quintilian, who practiced in Rome during that period. So this was what really brought her to the peak of her power and of notoriety, because she was not by background Roman, although she had Roman citizenship. After all, she belonged to a royal family. Because she was not by background Roman, because she was a queen of a conquered people, there was enormous pushback in Rome against Titus as a result of his liaison with Berenice.
What about before Titus? What was Berenice's life like?
Her rise to fortune largely had to do with the amazing meteoric ascent of her father, who was named Agrippa. And we know him generally as Agrippa I, because he had a son who was her brother, also named Agrippa. And so we know him as Agrippa II. But Agrippa I was a notoriously opportunistic person. As a result of the will of Herod the Great and the arrangements that Herod the Great had made towards the end of his life, it appeared that Agrippa I belonged to a part of the family which would never see power. And in fact, he came to the ancestral lands during the 20s of the Common Era in Idumea, which is where the Herodian family came from. He came to a place named Malata. And the reason he came there was that he was entirely broke. He married a cousin whose name was Cyprus. That turned out to be an extraordinarily shrewd move because as a result of the intercession of Cyprus, he was able to get himself an appointment by a Herodian relative who was also the governor of Galilee, Antipas. This is the same Herod who appears many times in the Gospels as the person who had John the Baptist murdered and who also sought to kill Jesus. Agrippa I becomes the market manager in Tiberias, a city that Antipas had recently founded. From there, he made his way to Syria to be in the protection of the governor there, whom he had known earlier in Rome. And then he made his big comeback to go to Rome again to try to acquire more influence by raising a loan in Alexandria. And he raised that loan because his wife, Cyprus, agreed to underwrite the loan, agreed to stand surety for it, and provided talents of precious metal, each of them weighing about 70 pounds, to the financier for this purpose. He went back to Rome and found a welcome, actually, in the imperial court of Tiberius, who wanted him to take care of his Tiberius' grandson, whose name was Gemellus. But he always preferred the person who became emperor, whom we know of as Caligula. Agrippa I and Caligula were great friends. That gives you an idea of the character of Agrippa I. And one day they were riding in a carriage, and Agrippa was heard to remark to Caligula, "Wouldn't it be a fine thing if Tiberius was off the scene and you became emperor?" Well, Agrippa I was put in prison and shackled. But to his enormous good fortune, Tiberius died. Caligula came to power. And when Caligula came to power, being a person of enormous excess, both positive and negative, when he was dealing with people, he gave to Agrippa I a golden chain, it is said, equal in weight to the chain that had shackled him. And also, he decided that he would appoint him to the title of king so that he could return to some of the ancestral lands. He didn't yet rule the whole of Judea, but he was on his way to doing so. That's really what brought Berenice to power, the amazing rise of Agrippa I. Agrippa managed to survive the reign of Caligula, was in Rome again at the time that Claudius was appointed. And Claudius, in his gratitude, gave Agrippa I all the territory that Herod the Great had once ruled, and he ruled it as a king. An absolutely astonishing rise to fortune. Agrippa himself had a brother. The brother's name was also Herod. I'm sorry about this, but the name Herod just shows up several times, and keeping track of which Herod you're dealing with is always a challenge, but that's the way the family did its business. And the two of them, Agrippa I and Herod, were in Rome at the time of the ascension of Claudius. And when they came to power, they put out a special coin that showed them as actually putting the diadem on the head of the emperor so that he could rule. So there was, within the Herodian dynasty as a whole, and it's really reflected in the propaganda of Agrippa I, a conception of the unity of the Roman Empire with the fate of Judaism. The brother of Agrippa I, Herod, was himself named king, but of a much, much smaller area, of an area known as Chalcis. By this time, Berenice had been married to her first husband, but he had died. When he did, Agrippa I married her off again to his own brother. And when she became the wife of Herod, Berenice became queen. And that's what caused her to be referred to as Queen Berenice for the remainder of her life. So that occurred in the year 44, so that by that stage, still quite young, because she was only born in 28, she had become a queen. She's known as such, and she's very much part of the power politics that the Herodian dynasty needed to play in order to achieve power and then maintain that power.
Who was King Polemon?
Polemon was the king of Cilicia, an area which will be familiar to readers of the New Testament as the place from which the apostle Paul came from, as well as from adjacent lands. And Polemon comes into the picture as a result of a subsequent marriage of Berenice, because I already mentioned she was married once, and that marriage ended in 44 as a result of the death of her husband. And then Herod also died. And as a consequence of that, she was, again, still a young woman, as it were, available for marriage. And the dynasty had a particular need at this stage for an advantageous marriage. The reason for that is that her father, Agrippa I, himself had died in the year 44, shortly after he arranged the marriage between Berenice and Herod. As a result of that, from that moment, Berenice becomes associated with her brother, Agrippa II, but Agrippa II does not inherit the reign of Agrippa I. He's still quite young. There are also signs of serious social disturbance within the lands of Judea, and Rome is reflecting on what best kinds of methods of governance should be used in order to try to establish some kind of order. Because that is going on, and living with her brother, Berenice joins in the policy of her dynasty, and in particular her own sisters, in making advantageous marriages. Polemon represented such an advantageous marriage because of the great wealth of the lands that he controlled, and also because imperial politics favored marriage between the family of one client king and the family of another client king. So all looked well for the marriage with Polemon. Polemon himself accepted circumcision in order to marry with Berenice. It was typical of the women in the Herodian dynasty to insist upon that when they married foreigners. But then, to some general scandal, that marriage fell apart. And Berenice returned to Caesarea Philippi to live with her brother, Agrippa II. Now, why did this occur? At that moment, an important character enters into the story who has to be assessed in order for the life of Berenice to be understood, and that is the historian Josephus. Josephus we often rely on for an understanding, of course, of the Jewish war. We should. He was a general in that war. He also tells us a great deal about Roman politics. But something always to bear in mind about Josephus is that as an historian, he was also himself a politician. He was playing the politics of Rome. And one can see in the writings of Josephus a definite change in the attitude towards Berenice. He writes two principal works. One of them is called The Jewish War. So you can easily imagine why historians of the New Testament are interested in him. And he also wrote The Antiquities of the Jews, which is a much larger work that he wrote towards the end of the first century. There's a big change in attitude towards Berenice in these two books. In The Jewish War, he describes Berenice's attempt in the time immediately before the war broke out to bring peace to the area. And he goes into great detail to describe how she undertook a voluntary vow of Judaism inside the temple, known as the Nazirite vow, and how in the process of practicing that, she confronted the Roman procurator of the time, Gessius Florus, in an attempt to get him to get his troops to stand down in their marauding of the population. When he refused, she herself was involved in an attempt to send a delegation to Rome in order to argue this case in front of the emperor. That ultimately failed, but there is no doubt about the admiration that Josephus had for Berenice at that stage. But then, years later, more than 20 years later, writing his Antiquities, he begins to write about Berenice as someone who was in a constant incestuous union with her brother. And this idea of the incest of Berenice, as I show in the book, grew up in her own time. It was part of the Roman pushback against Berenice when she was in Rome, and they feared her as the potential wife of Titus. But Josephus actually magnifies this. And he's not the only one. So, for example, does the poet Juvenal, years after Josephus. And one can see how the rumor developed, but one can also see how then Josephus starts to deploy it in his description of Berenice. So in the whole episode about Polemon, he claims, in my opinion, very implausibly, that the whole reason that Berenice wanted to marry Polemon was just to quelch the rumor of her incest with her brother. Well, by this time, she had plenty of means at her disposal in order to deal with propaganda that was necessary for her to establish her credentials in the dynasty. For example, there is still evidence today of a statue to Berenice in Rome in the Areopagus, She was known as a donor to the Jewish installations outside of her lands during the course of the first century. So propaganda was not her problem. Also, the motivation to marry Polemon was because Polemon was a significant ruler. The total wealth at his disposal was greater than the wealth of her own brother, Agrippa II. And so, in order to explain why then this marriage breaks up, Josephus then says, it very laconically, with remarkably little explanation of what precisely he means, this marriage broke up because of dissoluteness. And just that word, dissoluteness, akalosion in Greek. And he never says what precisely this is. But because elsewhere he accuses Berenice of incest, the natural inference on the part of the reader is that at the end of the day, Berenice can't be separated from Agrippa II. But in fact, if you look at the situation at the time, what you see is during this period, Polemon himself was in fact investigating a totally different alliance by marriage, not with this fraction of the Herodian dynasty that was represented by Berenice, but rather with a totally different woman named Julia Mamaea, whom later he actually made his queen. So it seems to be the case that what was going on was that Polemon preferred a different arrangement. Berenice was not going along with that at all. And it was for that reason that she returned to Agrippa II and her lands in what had been united Judea.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Hey, Jacob, you need to have Derek Lambert on what exactly he was taught and believed and when he was a Calvinist. What he said on that Wes Huff video was disturbing considering the predestination stuff. Never heard the details. Well, I'm not entirely sure all of what you're talking about. I mean, I know who Wes Huff is, and I know that Derek was a former Calvinist. I guess I'll have to ask him about that at some point. But thanks for the super chat. Anyway, back to the topic.
I could say, however, that there's an early form of the argument for predestination that appears in the description of Philo of Alexandria when he is detailing the rise of Agrippa I. And for those who are interested in the whole conception of providence and how it existed in the first century, and sometimes right outside a Christian setting, Philo of Alexandria is your person. And his entire conception of pronoia, literally God's advanced thought, all the way through his description of what happened to Agrippa I, is a sign of that. Philo is especially interested because I mentioned that Berenice had been married before she was married to Herod, the brother of Agrippa I. That first marriage was to an Alexandrian who was a relative of Philo of Alexandria. It gives you an idea of the networks that she was traveling in when you see that it involves not only emperors to be in the case of Titus, high priests, procurators, financiers in Alexandria, Philo of Alexandria, perhaps the greatest Jewish philosopher of his time. While she was in Jerusalem prior to the time of her Nazirite vow, the book of Acts also shows her with her brother sitting in council with the procurator Festus in order to judge what should be done with the case of Paul of Tarsus. So she's a person who, because of her extraordinarily adept maneuvering and her genuine ambition, winds up being connected with some of the major figures of power and influence during the first century.
Now, what happened during Titus's relationship with Berenice? And was it in any way intense due to the war that was going on? Was it controversial? How did that all go?
It was indeed profoundly controversial, and to some extent, an attempt was made on the part of Titus and indeed the Herodians to deal with it in a manner such that the scandal could be minimized. And as a result of that, for example, when Vespasian returned to Rome, it was to establish his own rule there. For that purpose, also, he linked up with Domitian, younger brother of Titus, although at this stage he's not a terribly useful figure. He tends to get himself more in trouble than he makes a contribution. But Titus is pivotal to Vespasian's success because they need to win the Judean War. That is their claim to great military competence and to the inheritance of the kind of power that would enable them to rule. By the time that Titus takes on that task, it does seem clear that the Romans are in a position of preeminence, but the war was still losable. At the end of the day, it is successful. After Berenice failed to intervene to stop the war happening at all, she began her liaison with Titus, became, as I said earlier, a great supporter of Vespasian's in his campaign to become emperor. And also, she and her brother, Agrippa II, were very much allies with Vespasian and Titus, not only gave them hospitality, but offered them military support. Agrippa II himself was lightly wounded during the course of combat. Once the war broke out, there was no doubt about their sympathy for the Roman side. And Berenice's position, like I must say the position of Josephus, was that the best settlement possible was one in which the Jerusalem temple was preserved, but within Roman hegemony. And there's good evidence that not only Berenice, but also Josephus, as the decades progressed after the destruction of the temple, were attempting to return to that status quo of the protection of the temple. But for the moment, when Vespasian and then later Titus enter Rome and they celebrate their triumph, this is in the year 71, there's no doubt that the image they wish to project to demonstrate their power is what they call Judea capta, that is, Judea captured. They strike that on their coins, and that becomes an important propaganda tool for all the Flavians. And the enormous wealth that they looted, much of it from the temple and Jerusalem, went into their enormous projects of building in Rome, including what we now think of as the Colosseum and also the Arch of Titus. During that period, Berenice is kept from Rome widely. That is, she's not part of the propaganda of captive Judea. She stays apart and only comes back to Rome in the year 75. Both she and Agrippa II are received at that time. And it's interesting that in that same year, Josephus publishes his Jewish War. So in that year, he's not yet really opposed to Berenice. On the other hand, he also does not describe the affair with Titus. That is, Josephus goes along with the Flavian line, which is that they're not going to acknowledge that this is going on. But in Rome, as I mentioned earlier, it's impossible to hide the affair. And as a result of that, there are people who speak out against the liaison. They see it as something that actually endangers the welfare of the empire, especially in view of the prospective ascension of Titus himself to be emperor. Now, something to bear in mind is that the idea of the emperor's biological son being the heir, as if there was a monarchy, was itself controversial. This was not the general procedure. It was not widely approved. So already there is a skepticism about turning from the emperor to his biological son, instead of having the emperor associated with someone whom he then adopts as a son for the purposes of reign. So the Flavians had to deal with that, and they were always subject to criticism on that score. But in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, is the whole issue of the relationship with someone from Judea, of all places. As part of the attacks on them, there are philosophers of the period associated with Stoicism who were known to be especially vicious and public in their attacks on Titus and Berenice. On these people, Titus could be enormously ruthless, having one whipped, having another killed. And during this period, during the 70s, prior to his accession in the year 79, the fact is that Titus acquired a reputation within Rome itself for violent behavior, including violent behavior in defense of Berenice. But the result of that is finally so to exacerbate reaction against Flavian rule that Titus needs to send Berenice away out of the imperial court. Then he does come to power, and at that moment, the question arises for how long it was intended that Berenice should, in fact, stay away from the imperial court. Was this intended to be a temporary measure? Was it, for example, something that was more the idea of Vespasian than it was the idea of Titus? And then, of course, once Vespasian died and Titus came to rule, after some time, there would be the prospect that the arrangement could be changed. We'll never know because of the early and unexpected death of Titus himself, despite the fact he was much younger than his father and apparently very vigorous. He died shortly after his accession in the year 81. The result of that is, as far as we can determine, Berenice's permanent abode becomes Caesarea Philippi again. It is possible she made the odd return visit to Rome, but we really do lose track of her because from that time, she simply loses her traction on power. And of course, power in Judea itself had largely been broken as a result of the war with the Romans.
And for my final question,
Mm-hmm.
what became of Berenice after Titus's death?
As far as we can see, she was in Caesarea Philippi. There's an open question as to how long she lived after that time and how long Agrippa lived. There is a reference in the writings of Josephus in his Antiquities, which would indicate that by the time he wrote the Antiquities, Agrippa II may have been dead. That would have been around the year 93. But at the same time, using that as a measure, it seems that in Josephus' mind, at any rate, Berenice is still a force to contend with because he continues criticizing her in the Jewish Antiquities. And also in a later work, I didn't mention before, but there's a later work of his called the Vita, the Life, where he spends a curious amount of time criticizing Berenice, which I think is a curious thing to do if the woman were actually dead. And for that reason, I suspect that she lived a bit longer than Agrippa II did, anyway, into the reign of Nerva, and perhaps even into the reign of Trajan. But it's interesting that we actually don't have listed by anyone the date of her birth. We have to infer it's 28 because of a reference to her age at a later stage in reference to Agrippa I. And we don't have a specific mention of the date of her death. It sort of illustrates the problem of historiography you have in writing about her, that she is not treated in her own terms.
And just to remind everybody real quick, the link to purchase Berenice, Queen in Roman Judea will be in the description below and the pinned comment. And with that being said, Bruce, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.